Okay. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. We really appreciate you joining, and we really appreciate the folks we have who are going to present today. This is the first of 3 sessions on planning for the ZEV transition. And we have a great couple of presenters today who have a lot of experience helping fleets figure these things out. I've had a lot of opportunity to talk to Chris and Mike about what they've been doing and all of the interesting sort of ways that they've had to find to help fleets figure these things out. So we're really lucky to have Chris White, who's a senior program manager with Frontier Energy, and her colleague, Mike Usen, who is, that's a great title, Mike, Electromobility and Resiliency Lead at DKS Associates. So I really appreciate you folks being here today and helping us out with this. I want to make sure that everybody's aware we have 2 more planning sessions that are coming up that Mike and Chris will both be teaching. And Mike and Chris, you might just quickly, before you get too deep into things, or at least at the conclusion, be sure to talk about what we'll be doing with these next 2 sessions. But for right now, I will stop talking and I will turn it over to you folks. And so I'll stop my screen share and you guys pick it up and take it away.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen here.
So while Mike brings that up and gets started, I want to tell you a little bit of the thought behind this. Like Tim said, Mike and I have been really lucky. And Mike, you're showing your presenter view.
I am.
So, yep.
All right.
So this really requires a different mindset. Most of the folks that we've been working with, municipal fleets, private fleets, are really used to buying a new car or truck when the one that they're operating breaks. And you're used to being able to go out and just get a quick bid from Sourcewell or whomever you're working with and find a replacement vehicle. And those of you who've been doing electric vehicles or zero emission vehicles for a while know that it doesn't work that way with these vehicles. Yeah, you can go out and buy a brand new electric car or a fuel cell car. And if you have a hydrogen station close by, you're set. But if you're bringing in electric cars, you got to have some planning there to make sure your infrastructure is in place. Then when we get to trucks, it's even a little bit more difficult. Most of the folks right now are on a 9-month to a year fulfillment cycle. So what we're sharing with you today is a little bit of what we're learning and doing and helping our fleet customers get ready so that they can have a plan in place to transition to ZEVs over a period of years. So Mike is going to start by talking about infrastructure. And then next week, we're going to talk about data collection. And then finally, how to really think about trucks. So with that, Mike, it is over to you.
Excellent. All right. So am I still sharing my my presenter view, or is this the regular one?
You are, but it's going to be fine.
Okay. I have 2 monitors, and I can't obviously operate my 2 monitors very effectively, but that's okay. I can help with the topic. So the topic of today is essentially about planning the infrastructure for the charging, and the subtitle is "Don't Overbuild and Don't Underbuild." And I think what we're trying to do is right size both the investments that are made and as well as the timing for that. And I'm going to be talking about a couple of things after I do a brief introduction and a brief infomercial for DKS. But why are we doing it? Why we're doing it now? And then I'm going to focus on 10 lessons that we've learned, Chris and I, from these many projects that we've been working on. And then I'm going to walk us through the process. So how we go through this. So hopefully once we can apply these lessons, and then I'll talk about sort of what the process is for doing this work. So first of all, we specialize, DKS is an electromobility company, and a transportation engineering company. My world is all about electromobility because there's a lot of it right now. We're focusing primarily on fleet electrification. And again, we partner with Frontier Energy on these projects. And we also do trans electrification and charging infrastructure planning for public charging networks as well. And then last but not least, the design of the installation of the charger. So that's essentially the work that we do. Where do we do it? We do it up and down the West Coast, mostly in California. We do a lot of it in Washington. I'm based in Seattle. We're headquartered in Portland. But the demand, as you know, is growing. And of course, we try to be there for our customers. And we have offices in California, Oregon, and Washington. So that's where we're doing this work. Why should we do this? Well, a couple of reasons. And most of you, I understand, are from public agencies. Public agencies have mandates to decarbonize your operations overall, and especially your fleet operations. And one of the great things about electrifying fleets is it's a very measurable way to track your carbon reductions. Of course, there's another benefit too, especially in California, which is to reduce air quality, or to improve air quality by reducing emissions. And then in theory, you should be able to reduce your total cost of ownership. And when I say that, is that right now we've seen that in the light duty segment. We're not yet there with the medium and heavy duty vehicles. Hopefully we will. And in an upcoming, and the third of the 3 series, we'll be talking a little bit more about medium and heavy duty vehicles. And then the other caveat is the charging infrastructure itself is very expensive. So if you don't include your charging infrastructure as part of the TCO analysis, the total cost of ownership analysis, it looks a lot better. So what we're trying to do very hard is come up with ways to cost effectively reduce the burden, the financial burden of designing charging infrastructure. So why should we do it now? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One, many agencies, and I suspect a lot of you on this call today, have specific mandates such as 2030 to replace your existing ICE fleet, your internal combustion engine fleet, with electric and other ZEVs, zero emission vehicles. Another reason, and this is, I think, a really important reason to think about, is the time frame. And especially for public agencies, it takes a while to get infrastructure into the ground and operational. It's typically around 1 year to 2 years between the time you begin the planning process and the time that charging infrastructure is operational, because you need time for construction, especially with a constrained supply chain like we have today. It takes a while to procure the hardware, especially for large fleet depots. You need to get it into your capital budget. And of course, planning takes some time. You know, the process that I'm going to talk about today typically takes anywhere from 4 months to 1 year. So just the planning alone, depending on the size and complexity of the issues that you have to address. And then, of course, there's opportunities to take advantage of. In California, where you guys are located, there's lots of funding opportunities. Those are first come, first serve. So if you can have your plans ready, you're most likely to be positioned competitively. And then if you're going to be buying vehicles, and now finally, Ford has announced the F-150 Lightning is coming out supposedly next month, but they're not really going to be available for another year or so. But if you're going to be buying those vehicles, you need to have that charging infrastructure on the ground. Now that those vehicles are there, you don't want to be in the awkward position of having your city manager say, hey, why don't we have electric vehicles in our parking lot? And you say, well, boss, we don't have the charging infrastructure, and it takes a while to get that. So now is really the time to begin the planning process. So I'm going to talk about some lessons that we've learned from a number of our clients up and down the West Coast. These are cities and counties in both California and Washington. These range in size from relatively small cities like Dublin and Albany, all the way up to big cities like Oakland and Seattle. And of course, the bigger the city, the greater the complexity, the more facilities, the more types of fleet vehicles, and so forth. Again, a lot of projects have very different scopes, so we've had to do a number of different things, but all of them have taught us some lessons. And these are the 10 lessons that I want to cover today, and then explain how those are applied. And I'm not going to read this list, but I will talk about them in the next series of slides. So the first lesson, I think, and this is chronologically the first lesson, not necessarily the most important lesson, is to engage the proper stakeholders early on and the right ones. It's one of the things, I'm a planner, not an engineer, although everyone that works with me on our projects are engineers. But in planning, one of the things that we've learned is that if you don't get the stakeholders engaged, having a meaningful say in the process, they're going to torpedo the results at the end, right? So they have to have ownership of the process. And they typically have a lot to offer. And so this This slide, which comes from the city of Tacoma, is the stakeholder group as well as the project team. And what we want to have is a relatively small project team so that you can actually get stuff done in the meetings, but ultimately having the key stakeholders engaged early and frequently so that they can provide the data that's needed and also ultimately the support when it comes time to implement the plan at the end. Lesson 2, scope the project carefully. So to do that, you need to have the right, you need to understand what the goals are, and you need to understand what the key questions are. So as you write your scope, whether you're going to be doing it in-house or hiring a consultant, that scope is really important because you need to stay on track. For the project manager to manage the project properly, they have to be staying on scope. So these are some examples of some of the many questions that we get asked by our clients to address, and we address them in a very detailed scope of work. Here's an example from the city of Bellevue, Washington that we're currently working on. And the slides at the end are going to kind of focus on how we actually deliver this work. And then, of course, that scope ties to a budget. So making sure that you have adequate resources before engaging in the process is really important. These projects are not inexpensive. There's a lot of effort involved. And if you look at the columns on the spreadsheet, those are the different staff that are involved. That includes the project manager, the engineers, someone who's leading the project, staff who are working on it, and so forth. And we need to have adequate time for each of them. Therefore, you need to make sure that there's sufficient funding available in your budget. So in the budgeting process, keep that in mind. These projects typically, depending on the size of the fleet, cost $50,000 to a couple $100,000. So they're not small efforts. Next lesson 4, compile the correct data. Okay, so there's sort of 2 sets of data, and we'll be getting into this much greater detail next week when Chris is presenting. But to do our analysis properly, we have to have the right data. The first set of data is on vehicles, and I'm not going to read through these, although I'm certainly happy to send you a spreadsheet with these questions if you want, and my email is available at the end. These are more data questions. Again, a lot of questions related to vehicle side, because the first step in the process, as I'll talk about in a minute, is analyzing the vehicle part of the equation. The second part is the facility. So again, a lot of different data, and I'll be talking about this later. On the facilities side, here's some more data needs that we have for analyzing the facilities part of the work. Okay, lesson number 5 is engaging your utility. One of the things about electric vehicles is they depend on electricity, right? Electricity is in most cases comes from a utility. Yes, we can use distributed energy resources to provide it on site, but ultimately you're going to be tied into your utility. Most of you are probably PG&E customers. PG&E is a very large organization, and like other large utilities, they tend to be fairly bureaucratic, and there's a lot of steps that you need to go through. So my advice is meet with them early and often. What we find working on a lot of our projects is that we have to go through several steps, and they can be tremendous resources. And what I'm finding is utilities are getting better and better at serving transportation electrification. Lesson 6, there are more than one way to charge a vehicle, and more than one way to charge a vehicle fleet, and I'll be talking about them. These are several of the different strategies that we analyze for every one of our projects. We have other strategies as well, but what we find is that different facilities, different agencies, different fleets can be optimized with different charging strategies based on the number of different variables that I'll be talking about. Lesson 7. We tend to focus on the budgeting for the capital, but the operating is also very important. So we've developed a tool for evaluating the operating costs of this, and it's very important to look at both the operating over time as well as the capital cost. So here's a sort of a screenshot of a very complex spreadsheet that looks at both that looks at all the different vehicles at each different site, and then looks at several different strategies. This one looks, the different colors represent different charging scenarios that we evaluate, and then we can help our clients understand which is the most cost effective. Sometimes cost effective for capital does not necessarily equate to cost effective for operational, because there's different needs. Lesson number 8, seek potential revenue opportunities. You are all from California, I understand, where unlike here in Washington, where I am, you have funding opportunities available. So there's a number of different grant and rebate programs. Chris is an expert in that topic. There's also other opportunities, such as you can charge for charging while your chargers are not being used for fleet charging, if they're available to the public or to agency employees. There's also low carbon fuel standard credits that can help underwrite some of your investments. And then in the future, we'll be having grid services revenues through bidirectional charging. And so the image on the upper right is a project we did for South San Francisco, showing how some of those chargers could be shared between different users, either the public or employees, as well as for fleet vehicles. And then down at the bottom is a diagram that explains bidirectional charging. If we had another hour, I could get into that, but I don't. So instead, I'm going to move on to lesson number 9, which is strategically implementation of project phasing. So as I mentioned earlier on, light-duty vehicles are very cost-effective, less so today for medium and heavy-duty vehicles. There are now available electric vehicles at all different vehicle classes, all the way from class 1 to class 8. But they tend to be more expensive. Again, we'll be talking about that in an upcoming session. Another strategic implementation consideration is timing infrastructure deployment over the time when you're replacing vehicles and doing it at the right facility. So this is a project we did for King County Facilities Management Division, looking at 6 of their facilities and different vehicles over time to make sure that they met their carbon reduction mandates. And then another thing is to consider is make sure you have adequate expansion capacity. It does not make sense to build out all of your infrastructure at one time, because you're going to be replacing your vehicles over time, and the technology is changing fast. So it doesn't make sense to make big investments on the charger, but it does make sense to put the conduit in and build additional capacity by upsizing your panels appropriately and stubbing out additional conduit so that you can add wiring to add to charging as over time. And then the last part of that, the last lesson here, is being open to new ideas and technologies. Again, we're not going through an evolutionary technological change. We're going through disruptive technological change. So it's amazing how much technology has changed just in the 4 years that I've been working on these projects. Looking forward, which we need to do, we're here in 2021. We have a pretty good idea as to what's happening now between now and say 2024 in terms of both electric vehicles, based on what industry has announced, as well as on the charging infrastructure side. Beyond that, it starts getting increasingly fuzzy. So it's difficult to make long-term investments without running the risk of stranded assets. And the last thing you want to do is tell your boss, well, we made a decision 5 years ago, we bought all this stuff, and now we're getting rid of it. And our client, City of Seattle, has boxes and boxes of Eaton chargers that they never installed, and now they're obsolete. And I think that's kind of a shame, but sometimes that happens. Fortunately, they were paid for by federal dollars, so it's not a big problem, at least not for the city. Another thing is right-sizing the fleet. So I'll talk about that in a minute. Sharing chargers. There's now one of the ways to finance these projects is through infrastructure as a service, or even mobility as a service. And we have a number of contacts in that industry that can help with that. Bidirectional charging is something that's coming online in the next couple of years. And then automated charging, both inductive and robotic charging. So as we move toward automated vehicles, it makes sense to consider automated charging. And those technologies are also coming online. So the next set of slides I'm going to be talking about, and really the focus of today's presentation, is how you go through the process of planning your fleet electrification. So what are the steps needed to go through? So this is a diagram that kind of explains in a real conceptual high level what this should look like, right? So the first step is looking at the vehicles. And again, we'll be talking about this a lot more next week. And then using the analysis of the vehicles to determine what we're talking about is the existing vehicle fleet. So most fleets currently today are powered by gasoline and diesel. Ultimately, those will all be electric and maybe some fuel cell and possibly some other types of fuels as well. So we need to do an energy needs analysis. And what we can do is we have a model that takes the existing fuel data that we get and then converts that into BTUs and into kilowatt hours. Then once we know that, we can look at each site where those vehicles are parked overnight to determine the what's required to charge, and then ultimately look with multiple charging strategy options with the fleet and facilities managers to make the right recommendations. And then the last thing is we need to implement this, we need to finance it, and we need to phase implementation over time. So that's in a sort of a very high level conceptual overview of what the process looks like. So how does that work in terms of getting the actual work done? Well, we have sort of a 5-phase or 5-task scope of work. And it's important that we consider all 5 of these phases. Depending on the scope can vary, but in general, this is sort of I think a fairly good model to work with. And the next series of slides kind of talks about this in more detail. So task 1 is project management. And one of the things we see a lot of is requests for proposals that our clients send, and they ignore this as a task, which forces us basically to somehow hide this into our budgeting for other tasks, which basically means that we're robbing resources from key tasks. Ultimately, we have to be able to do these things. We have to be able to have time to meet with our clients to discuss things over time to make sure that we're on track. That takes time, and we need to budget for that time. We need to invoice on a regular basis, and that takes time. We need to, of course, have a project work plan and do other tasks internally that adds value to the project, and therefore these things need to be budgeted for. So something to keep in mind. Typically, you want to spend anywhere from 5 to 15% of the total project budget is on project management. Task 2, and this is the part that again we'll be talking about a little bit more next week, is evaluating the vehicle fleet. So we need to understand, the first step I always recommend is make sure you're not, that the size of your vehicle fleet is correct. A lot of vehicle fleets have a lot of unused vehicles, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Making sure that the policies that we're aware of the right policies so that we're hitting the right targets, that we have the correct data and so forth. So let's go through that and what this means in a little more detail. So the first step is right sizing the fleet. Again, what we see a lot of vehicles that get very underutilized. This is an analysis that we just did last week for the city of Bellevue, Washington, showing the distribution of vehicles by vehicle miles traveled and vehicle count. As you can see, there's a few vehicles that drive a whole lot. Most drive very few, under 5,000 miles per year, which equates to a relatively light utilization. And then there's some at the bottom that hardly drive at all. So our question is, do we really need those vehicles that hardly drive at all? Now, if it's a specialty vehicle like a Vector or something that you need on occasion, that probably is a vehicle that you probably need to keep. But maybe it's a sedan that could be replaced with a pool vehicle instead. So a first step is sizing the fleet properly, and that's important because you don't want to end up having to invest in charging infrastructure for vehicles that never need to get charged. So next step, part of the second task here is policy and funding considerations. Make sure you know what the targets are. Different municipalities, different counties have different targets for typically for either electrifying their vehicle fleet or achieving carbon neutrality. Generally speaking, we're seeing sort of I'd say the average is a full electrification of light duty vehicles by the year 2030. A lot of municipalities allow a little bit longer time frame for the medium and heavy duty vehicles, which makes sense because they're not quite as far along as light duty vehicles will be by 2030. And it can range. So anyway, it's really important to know what those targets are so that we hit them. The last thing you want to do is plan for 15-year fleet replacement when you have to do it in 5. So anyway, something to keep in mind. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about data. So we are very data dependent. We love to have telematics data. That's sort of the gold standard, or I should say the lithium standard, because I'm an EV nut. Telematics data is rare. What I find is we always ask for it, and very few fleets currently have it for significant percentages of their fleet so far. We've only worked with, I think, with the city of Oakland is the only fleet so far that we've worked at that has really a significant percentage of their vehicle fleet with quality telematics data. So what do we use instead? Well, we use what we got. You got fuel records, right? So fuel records are a really important source. Maintenance records, the fleet asset inventory, and so far, every fleet I've worked with has some kind of an asset inventory, and we can use that. And then The truth is, though, data doesn't tell the full story. It tells us some information, but to understand that information, we really need to interview the fleet manager and the facility manager and other key stakeholders that need to be part of the project team to really understand what's going on that the data doesn't tell us, because the spreadsheet only tells you so much. So it's really important to include the human sources of data as well. And then in addition to that, we use supplemental data, and there's a number of different sources. And by the way, I can share a spreadsheet that has all this information so you don't have to take notes. Here's an example of a database from the city of Fremont, California, looking at, an example of some of their inventory. They've got hundreds of vehicles, and we need to be able to analyze that. We have we have data scientists that crunch these numbers, make sure we're informing our analysis properly. This is from the city of Berkeley. Again, we need to know where those vehicles are parked. We need to know which department they're in and how much fuel they use and so forth, so we can make the right, that we can analyze it properly. Okay, here's a spaghetti chart that shows kind of what we do with all this data. I'm not gonna give you a headache trying to explain how this works, but there's a lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes. And it looks something like this. Again, this varies from project to project, scope to scope, but data science is what it is. Okay, the third task, we have understood the energy requirements that comes from analyzing the vehicle part of the analysis. Then we start to look at the facilities part. And again, another data exercise. So we'll be querying you or whomever your consultant is, or if you're doing it in-house, you do it yourself, to make sure you have the right information. And we have a number of different sources. And again, I can share this information so you don't have to write it down, but I want to talk about some of the key ones in the next couple of slides. So what do we use for sources? Well, first of all, we love as-built drawings, because that tells us, ultimately what we're trying to do is figure out where to put the chargers, what kind of chargers, and so forth. So the more we understand about the existing physical plant, the better off we are. Unfortunately, a lot of the facilities that fleets park in are not new, and the drawings no longer exist. So, if you don't have that, then we can go to Google Earth if it's a surface lot. If not, then we do a site visit and we do the best we can. A lot of agencies have in-house electricians who typically have been there for a long time, who can provide a lot of information. If you don't have any information, data logging is a great source. It takes about a month or so to collect that data that way, but if you have the resource to do that, that's certainly a great way. And then, as we did with on the fleet side, we can interview the facilities managers to understand. So one of the things we need to think about is, are you going to be replacing that facility 3 years from now? Because if so, is that really a place that we want to make an investment? Or if you are going to be upgrading the facility, maybe that's the time to be adding the chargers, because it makes much more sense to do charging infrastructure as part of a larger electrical upgrade if you're, say, electrifying your HVAC system. And a lot of facilities are upgrading their HVAC systems to electric for the same reason that they're replacing their ICE fleet with electric vehicles, because they're trying to reduce their carbon footprint. And there's some great opportunities if you're doing both, because you can use load management to power both the vehicles and the facilities, and while avoiding demand charges on your electrical rates. Again, a number of different supplemental sources for this data as well. So here's some examples of as-built drawings and line drawings. Again, if you have it, great. If not, we can work around it, but certainly we can get more precision if these drawings are available and these drawings are accurate. Obviously, with older facilities, a lot of times modifications have been made, and a lot of times those modifications include increasing the electrical load. So if the drawings are inaccurate because additional load and you're starting to exceed your electrical capacity, you're getting close to it, that's something we need to know. And that's why doing things like data logging and talking to your electricians and looking at your utility bills can help us inform that. So here's the utility bill from Avista, which is the utility that serves Spokane, Washington. Here's just an example of what that looks like. So if we don't have telematics, we can use other sources of information. So then we get into the charging analysis. One of the things that we are obsessed with is trying to figure out a way to make charging more cost effective. The biggest killer to the pro forma or your TCO analysis is the capital investments and the associated operational costs for charging infrastructure, right? So what we find is that the biggest cost, and this is just one example, this from the city of Seattle, which has, has some, things are very expensive here. Labor is very expensive here in Seattle. And so the total charger cost, this is the cost of an installed charger. Only about 10% of it is the actual charger itself. So the tip of the iceberg represents the charger cost. The rest of it is all the other parts of that cost. This beach ball changes the shapes of, the slices of pie shapes change from project to project. But don't assume that the charger is anywhere close to the majority of the cost. Electrical service upgrades can be very, very expensive, although what I'm seeing is a lot of utilities are really providing support by providing the make ready, depending on where your fleet is located. And then, of course, resiliency is a big consideration. And as Tim mentioned, resiliency is in my title. When I came up with that title, I didn't realize how important resiliency would be. That was before PG&E started to kill the power every time the wind blows in California. So a big key question that we always get asked is, yeah, well, what if the wind dies? What if the power dies? Well, there are other alternatives, and our partners at Frontier Energy where Chris is from are experts in this particular set of services. We do recommend considering this as part of your scope, especially if you're in California. You're a little ahead of us in terms of this issue, but there are ways, and there are cost-effective ways to add distributed energy resources through solar and battery energy storage, or some combination of the two. Here in Washington, we don't have quite as much sunshine as you have, so we rely more on on-site generators powered by renewable diesel. But this is a very important consideration to have in the project. So once we have analyzed these costs, we have to really look at the cost for the different charging infrastructure. Again, these are expensive typically, and then we start looking at how to budget this. So the last of the sort of substantive tasks, the final task is actually putting it all together into the deliverable, but the last of the substantive tasks are really doing analysis of putting it all together by looking at the charging and so forth, and developing some recommendations. So, we need to know how many chargers, what type of chargers, where those chargers are located. This typically involves field work. If you have in-house staff that can do that instead of hiring a consultant, that's great, but typically we have to get involved. And then, we want to look at all the different costs. So the next series of slides talks a little bit about that. The first thing to think about, though, is what do you really need? And again, the title of this presentation addresses that. So we don't want to oversize the charging infrastructure, nor do we want to undersize it. So we want to look for the optimal size. Well, how do you do that? So the first thing is thinking about what's involved in charging a fleet vehicle. Most fleet vehicles, especially municipal fleet vehicles, are parked all night long. And these circle graphs on the top of the slide represent a 24-hour day. The black represents when those vehicles are in service. When they're in service, let's assume that they're not available to charge, although a lot of vehicles, as you know, aren't necessarily driving all day. A lot of them, they're parked during the day. But for the sake of, to be conservative, we're going to assume that for an 8-hour day or a 12-hour day, depending on your fleet, are not available for charging. But that still leaves the majority of the 24-hour day shown in gray on these charts as times that they're available. Now, there's 3 different colors, red, green, and blue, and those represent different charging speeds. Now, you can buy level 2 chargers, which are the most common form of chargers, or at least, and typically the most cost effective. They come in different charging speeds. So you can size your chargers appropriately, and our analysis tool does that. But anyway, these are 3 different examples. So as you can see, even with the slowest charger, you still have the majority of the night available. So therefore, as you can see on the bottom of the slide, and this is showing 2 different battery sizes. So using the Nissan Leaf, which is sort of the least costly light duty electric vehicle, you can buy that vehicle in either a 42 kilowatt hour battery or a 60 kilowatt hour battery. If you have a 42 kilowatt hour battery, you only need to charge it once or twice a week. With a 60 kilowatt hour battery, assuming you're driving about 25 miles per day, you only need to charge it every week and a half or so. And so you really don't need to have dedicated chargers, one charger per vehicle. It's nice to have, it's certainly more convenient, and it may save you operationally, but you don't need it. So as we go through the analysis, these are the kind of things you want to think about. So charging times varies by, there's a number of different variables to keep in mind. The first, of course, is the charger speed, and charging speeds are available. And if you can look at the middle part of the graph where it says level 2 chargers, they're available anywhere from a 3.6 all the way up to a 19.2 kilowatt charger. Typically, the faster chargers are a little bit more expensive. We recommend those for certain applications, such as where there's a percentage of medium duty vehicles or even heavy duty vehicles with light duty cycles, because they can get by with a faster level 2 charger. And some of the new chargers are available at multiple speeds, especially the smart chargers that have load management capability. So you have some variability. In some cases, you can get by with level 1 chargers. Level 1 chargers charge slowly, but if that vehicle isn't used very often or it has a large battery, maybe a level 1 is all you need. And our analysis addresses that. The most cost-effective way, ironically, to charge many fleet vehicles is with DC fast chargers, because you can charge a vehicle just like you would with an ICE vehicle at a gas station if your charger if your vehicle can accept a fast enough charging. However, very few vehicles today, other than say Teslas, Porsches, and Audis, have the ability to charge at very high speeds. So that's something to keep in mind. Depending on when you're going to replace the vehicles, the acceptance rate is a really important consideration. And all vehicles have different acceptance rates. That's not something that's readily available. They don't typically want you to know that, because a lot of them are very slow. Hopefully that will speed up in the future, but don't assume that just because you have a 350 kW charger, you'll be able to charge your vehicle at 350 kilowatts. Most likely you'll be limited by the acceptance rates, which are shown here in this column. So let's talk about some of the charging strategies. We've identified a number that we work with. There's some others as well that aren't shown on here, but it makes for a rather busy slide. But the ones that are most common are sort of, I think the baseline is a dedicated charger where every vehicle gets assigned its own dedicated charger where it parks. This makes sense in certain applications, such as where you have for example, at a really small facility where you only have a few vehicles to charge, and you have plenty of power, and you don't need necessarily smart charging capability. This is sort of the most simple. And sometimes you can get by, as I mentioned, with level 1 as well as level 2 charging. Then the next one up from that is sort of dedicated level 2 charging with load management. So the load management is a way to do two things. Number one, it reduces the peak peak electrical load requirements, allowing a smaller electrical service. So one of the biggest cost items is increasing the size of the electrical capacity with a service upgrade. That's typically, those costs are passed along from the utility to the fleet. So that's something to be avoided. So that's one of the benefits of load management. The second benefit is to avoid demand charges. In California, most utilities charge very steep demand charges. And so that's something that you want to avoid by all means if you can. And then thirdly is, of course, it can tie into your facility load system, which is also something that Frontier Energy can help you with. The third charging strategy option is shared level 2 chargers. And again, as I showed in the previous slide, most fleet vehicles can get by sharing chargers because there's plenty of battery capacity relative to the daily duty cycle. And then a fourth method is sharing DC fast chargers. And what we often do is have some hybrid of these, where we might have a small facility might have dedicated level 1 and level 2 chargers. Larger facilities would have either dedicated level 2 chargers with load management, or shared level 2 chargers, or even shared level 2 chargers with load management. And then maybe a supplemental DC fast charger to provide opportunity charging when needed, when somebody forgets to plug the vehicle in, or if you have a medium or heavy duty vehicle that just can't get by And then you could also supplement your own DC fast chargers with public charging. One of the great things about California is you have a lot of public charging available. And so you can use those. The challenge is you can't depend on having those available. Those are not reservable by a fleet typically. There's some others that aren't shown on here. For example, if you don't own your own facility, why would you make the investment? So in a case like that, we would recommend using mobile charging that has a built-in energy storage. And there's a number of new technologies that are available so that the investment comes in the charging hardware rather than in the facility upgrade. But I didn't want to include that on the slide just because it gets a little messy. So here's an example of how we would apply that. I think this is for the city of Berkeley, where we actually did a combination of different charging strategies, again, trying to optimize them for the unique needs of each facility. And not all facilities are created equal. In fact, most of the large fleets have a big variety of facilities, and there's a big difference in cost on a per charger basis from facility to facility. And it's really important to understand that and don't assume that one charging strategy works for every facility, for every department, or for every class of vehicle. Another thing that is really important is once you understand the charging needs and the charging strategies that make the most sense is to understand the facility itself. Ultimately, charging for all but the mobile or the DC fast charging is very much dependent on the facility. And so it's important to really look at how those facilities affect the installation from a physical perspective. How many holes you have to drill through the floor or through the wall? Is the building a PT slab? If so, you can't cut through, or you might endanger the structure, which means you have to get into doing x-rays of the facilities. So you're better off to consider those kind of things. And so there's a lot of engineering involved depending on the facility. Obviously, a parking lot is typically a little simpler, but larger fleets tend to be in urban areas. Land's too expensive, so you have to park at a garage. What else to consider? Well, communication. Typically we recommend smart charging, although not all fleets use smart charging. But if you do use smart charging, those chargers need to communicate, right? They need to have either Wi-Fi connectivity or cellular connectivity or near field communications. If you don't have either of those, there's some other methods as well that I could talk about if we had time. But that's something that has to be considered. What kind of chargers do you want to use? Single or dual pole? Do you need to have a pedestal? Do you need to have a cord retractor? Is it coming from the ceiling because you don't have any wall to mount the conduit along? Operationally, how the parking is aligned is going to affect where you put the charging. Is there adequate lighting, right? If you're in a parking lot at night that's open to the public, is it going to be safe? Especially in northern latitudes where I am, it gets dark in the late afternoon. That's something that needs to be considered for safety. Security can be important. Are you going to be putting these in public locations where they're subject to vandalism? How do you install the conduit? So those are some of the considerations that need to be factored into the analysis, again, looking at the facility. Okay, once you've figured all of that out, then the question is, when do you do it? And what are your priorities? So I recommend that we first identify some kind of a priority sequence, because you typically have some time to get these involved. Not all facilities you have the same priority. So identifying, high, medium, and low is sort of a simple way to do that. And then develop a phasing strategy. And that phasing strategy needs to consider the vehicle replacement, because obviously you don't need chargers until you have the vehicles, or at least relatively close by. If you have the chargers too far in advance, you run the risk of getting the wrong kind of charger. And maybe a more cost-effective option comes along in the future. Another consideration is the funding source. If you can get somebody else to pay for your chargers or vehicles or both, so much the better. Again, in California, a lot of the utilities are heavily engaged in that, and as is the air quality districts and the CARB, California Air Resources Board, all of whom have, or not always have funding, but there's enough funding opportunities that's worth considering. Both Frontier and DKS track this because this is really important to know. And then, think about how those chargers are being used. Are these going to be used just by the fleet vehicles? Are they going to be shared during the day by employees? Because sometimes if those fleet vehicles are out on the road, maybe those chargers are sitting unused. You can provide a nice perk to your employees by allowing them to charge and potentially recoup some revenue from that as well, and possibly the general public as well. And these chargers can be, especially the smart chargers, they can be used for multiple uses that can help justify the investment. So if you're strategic enough, you can also save some money. This is a project we did for the city of Seattle. There's 4,000 vehicles. Our charge was to evaluate how to and when to add charging infrastructure. And so we developed a baseline scenario, which was dedicated chargers, and then these supplemental fuel islands, and essentially electrifying the entire fleet. But then and the total budget for that project was $227 million, which is a very large hit on even a big city like Seattle. So we went back to the drawing boards and looked at it from a different way. And said, okay, what if we were to have not dedicated chargers and use load management, and which would reduce the electrical infrastructure size at each facility, and we shared those chargers among more vehicles. And then we delayed the investments for the fire department because fire trucks are very expensive as diesels. They're way more expensive and harder to obtain as zero emission vehicles. So put those off later in the plan, which buys some time, and due to the magic of financing, we were able to reduce the project total budget by about a third. And so again, thinking strategically can be very cost effective as a way to do that. So how do you implement that? Well, again, think about using time as your friend and budgeting over time to make sure that the project can be handled. And obviously, very few agencies that I've worked with have the kind of resources to be able to budget it all up front. If you don't and need to, you can outsource the whole thing by going with a charging as a service provider or a mobility as a service provider that will do all the financing and essentially own and operate everything, and replace a CapEx with an OpEx investment if that works for your financing department. The last task is, of course, the deliverables. We typically prepare a static report, but we also can do websites or some kind of an online portal, which may make more sense. Obviously, the quality of that document is really important, and so making sure at the beginning, when you're scoping and budgeting the project, that you allow sufficient resources to do a quality report, I think is really important. We love doing beautiful documents. Some of you may need beautiful documents, some not, but in any case, that's a very important part of the project and something to be that should hopefully do a lot more than sit on the shelf like the ones behind me. So these are some examples of some of the reports that we've done for various clients. Some of them are websites and so forth. Again, they vary from scope to scope, budget to budget, but something that we try very hard is to make sure that whatever we produce is usable by the fleet manager and the facility manager to get these projects done. So that's it for my slides. We do have some time for questions, and here's my contact information. If you would like it, I can share with you some information such as this presentation, which Tim is recording. And I think Tim's going to share it as well. We also have a spreadsheet that shows those questions, which I think before you start any process, you should at least pull your data together. And the more data that's available, the easier it is to understand how to scope and budget for that project, and then basically an outline of the scope itself. So what I encourage the clients that we work with is to work collaboratively with us on both the scope and the budget, so that we're really addressing the right questions and meeting the needs appropriately. Questions?
Dwight McCurdy asks, what's the rough average cost per EVSE for a fleet installation? And so I'm going to suggest you take that with a dual head level 2, because we mostly do those.
Well, okay, for Alameda County, I'm just going to use a project off the top of my head because we just finished that analysis. The average was about 18,000 and change. And so that's, and again, one of the things that we work with our clients is every agency has uses some budgeting assumption such as a contingency cost. And I can't remember what their contingency is, but that includes the project contingency. So I don't know if it'll actually cost that installed. So that's based on our estimate, not on actual installation price.
And just to be clear too, that starts at the panel and goes to the finished charger.
Correct. And by the way, Gabir, who is our awesome electromobility, one of our awesome electromobility engineers at DKS from our Sacramento office, is joining our call. So Gabir, if I am out of line on any of my responses, feel free to correct me.
So, and Carrie asked about an estimate range on how much one of these fleet plans cost. And Carrie, I'm going to say too, Mike showed you part of the plan, so it also includes your entire vehicle transition plan. And for some of our clients, they also want a whole resiliency plan that includes battery storage and you know, more things like that too. So I know you're going to hate it depends, but kind of depends on what you want. But Mike, I will let you answer that.
All right, and Chris, you're welcome to jump all over me if I speak out of line as well. So Chris and I work collaboratively in most of these projects, and so they range, you know, so we can do this two ways. And don't worry, I'm not dodging the question. I'll answer it, but I just want to provide a little context. So we can come at this two ways. One, we can say, okay, how much do you want to spend? We can figure out with you what the most cost-effective way to spend that available investment is. So that's what we did with the city of Tacoma. So city of Tacoma said, we have $60,000 to spend. We want the biggest bang for the buck. And we worked with them and their utility to share some of that work so that we can leverage each other's skills and expertise. The other and more traditional way is, okay, tell us, here's our scope, give us a cost. And so we can work either way. Projects typically range anywhere from about $50,000 up to a couple of $100,000, again, depending on the scope, scale, and budget. And they could cost considerably more than that if we go into design. So typically our projects go from sort of high levels strategy all the way into preliminary design. And so it really depends on kind of what the needs are. But we try to be very sensitive to the client's budgeting available, what's available, as well as kind of what the key issues are.
So
Hopefully
and if
that
I
answers the
can,
question.
and I just want to throw two other things in there too. Tim said we've done about 40 fleets so far, and that might be about right. And we find a great deal of the budget is spent finding the information, which is why we're starting to do these webinars, because if we can help you start collecting the information now, when we or another consultant comes in, that can cut money out of the project, but it can also literally cut months out of the project. And next time I'm going to actually give you a spreadsheet and show you what we need and where it's missing and how to find it. The other thing is if you are applying for CCAT funding from SEC Metro AQMD, that funding will now allow you to use some of it for this fleet planning exercise. So I think Gina and Erica are here, or Tim, and they can give you more detail about that, but know that SEC Metro AQMD has really thought this through and is providing some funding for that. And then Ralph reminded us that CEC is going to release a $50 million grant for hydrogen and EV charging. And we're also expecting to see a lot of federal money coming through as well, although a lot of the federal funding, it sounds like now, is going to be directed to the Department of Transportation. Mike, Amy asks about funding in Oregon and what we might be doing in Oregon.
Excellent question. So unlike Washington, but like California, Oregon has an LCFS program. So there is revenue available. So charging generates revenue, and that revenue goes back to the state that's making that available. Even though DKS is headquartered in Oregon, we haven't been doing any electromobility in Oregon, although I think that's about to change in the next couple of weeks. Fingers crossed. So I'm not an expert in Oregon, but I'd be more than happy to get back to you, Amy. Feel free to email me, and I'd be happy to chase that down, because that's part of the work we're going to be doing under these scopes of work anyway, and I'd be happy to share that information.
first off, if you are not in California or not in Sacramento, your Clean Cities coordinator is a wonderful source of information. So Amy, you might check in with Maddie, who is your Clean Cities coordinator in Oregon. The other thing is you can email or call Mike and me about anything. It just, if you have a question, we are here for as a resource. If you want to tell us how your day is going, share a funny joke, trade stories with us, please reach out. We really want to be not just your consultant, but your partner in helping this really difficult transition into a new technology. So
while people come out with questions, one other announcement to make, and that is if any of you are going to Government Fleet Expo in a couple of weeks in Orlando, Chris and I are going to be facilitating an interactive workshop on this. So we're not going to be doing a presentation. Instead, it's going to be a discussion among fleet managers. As Chris said, we do care about this. We do want to talk to you, and we want to understand your experience. In consulting, we're kind of behind a computer screen, but we're not working directly with the vehicles or the facilities. So it's really important for us to be engaged with that. And so hopefully, if you come to the GFX, Government Fleet Expo, come and join our session. It's going to be interactive in actual real live in person. If you can remember how to do that, hopefully I can wear a mask and still speak. But I look forward to seeing you if you come.
So I don't see another question in chat, but I do have a question for you, Mike, and that is in California. The Advanced Clean Fleet Rule is coming down the pike very quickly, and it will affect all public agency fleets and basically a lot of other fleets that have over 50 vehicles, and it will also affect that's private companies, and it will affect private companies that basically have loading docks or other setups where vehicles arrive and depart. But specifically for fleet operators, when you're looking at a fleet and you're helping them figure out what to do, how much of that Advanced Clean Fleet Rule process plays into what you're telling them about the power demands that they will have, the space demands that they will have, the facility demands that they will have as they have to go quickly to 100% zero emission vehicles in all weight classes?
So obviously that only applies to our California projects, but that is an important consideration. And again, we started doing this before the Advanced Clean Fleet Rule came along. So here's, and again, we'll be getting into that more on the third of the three webinars, because that's really where we're focusing on the vehicles that are impacted by that particular regulation. That said, as I mentioned earlier in the slides, being strategic about essentially delaying the medium and heavy duty vehicles for economics, that makes sense, but it doesn't comply with that particular regulation. So the good news is, the bad news is right now there's very few medium and heavy duty vehicles that meet the needs of fleets that are cost effective. The delta between especially in a heavy duty vehicle is much broader between a diesel and an EV or a fuel cell EV than it is for a light duty vehicle. So that's a big budget hit. And there's a lot of vehicles that aren't even available at any price. So that's going to be a real challenge implementing that. The good news is that we can model the energy demands of any vehicle. Even if an electric vehicle doesn't exist, we can at least model it so that we can decide what's needed for the charging infrastructure, and upstream of that, what's needed for the electrical service. Because ultimately, the longest lead item typically is working with the utility and the contractor to get the make-ready charging infrastructure into the ground even before you select the charger or purchase the vehicle. So we can do that, and we do that. And I would highly recommend doing that if you're in California, because you're mandated to do that. Personally, I'm a little bit troubled by the aggressive schedule of the Advanced Clean Truck Rule relative to where the automotive truck industry is today. I'm hopeful that they will get it together and we'll start producing production scale medium and heavy duty vehicles that will allow you guys to comply with that regulation.
I don't see anything, Mike. So I guess at this point we can wrap it up. Thank you very, very much for everything you've done. I really appreciate it. And I'm very much looking forward to next Tuesday when we get to the next presentation. See you then.
Hey, thank you for attending and thank you for your interest in this really important topic. We have to decarbonize transportation. It's something that's really, really important. So you're doing the hard work, but it's really important to do. So thank you.